Okay. So good morning, everybody. Come on, that was lame. Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
All right. Thanks for making the time this morning. What we're going to do is probably spend the next 45 minutes kind of give you guys our first impressions after being here for 2.5 days. I will tell you that as we start this process, we took a look at, obviously having done some of the strategic planning 10 months ago with the community, I'm familiar with it. Ben coming with a fresh set of eyes. We use some background data, your strategic planning, your master plan, were all background information as we came into this process. And what we were really here to do, just as a recap, is really kind of concentrate on 4 areas. So the academic development plan, a strategic communications plan, which also includes the community marketing strategy, the place branding plan, and then a downtown redevelopment plan. So that was really the focus of what we're here to do. So we're going to talk about the academic development plan at first. And again, I want to reiterate that this is our initial thoughts. Our timeline is we want to make sure that we're going through this process and that we hope to have a finished product, set of plans and branding system for you by October. But this is our initial thought. So some background information I think is important as we talk about the recommendations is talking a little bit about the market. It's a little bit hard to see because of the lack of, or the too much light here. But when we look at the market data is really divided up into 3 areas of drive time. So we did 5-minute drive time, a 15-minute drive time, and a 45-minute drive time. And again, it's kind of hard to see with the lack of color here. But we've got the 5-minute is kind of the immediate OSCODA area, closest to the downtown. We use the central point, by the way, as the township hall. So that was the main intersection within town, the main commercial corridor within the township. And then we did kind of a 15-minute from there, and then we did a 45-minute, which kind of stretches way up into Alcona and down into Aranac counties to kind of get an idea of kind of what the market looks like. So the 5-minute are the folks who are kind of here every day. The 15 minutes also probably more daily, but it's a little bit more effort than say the folks who are closer to that main part of town. And then the 45-minute is that area that's probably about a once a week. Again, this is going to be a little bit hard to see. What we wanted to show you was the retail gap, the overall retail gap. And what a retail gap is the difference between the amount of demand within the community and the amount of supply within various retail sectors. So this is going to be important when we talk about the commercial development side. But on the demand side, within that 5-minute, you guys have $30 million, $30.7 million, almost $30.8 million of total demand within that 5-minute area of downtown. The supply, you have $51.7 million of supply. So actually what happens is when you have more supply than demand, you have what's called a surplus, it's a surplus of supply. So what that typically means, and I wouldn't worry about that all that much, is that there is more supply than there is demand within that 5 minutes. But what that signifies here in OSCODA is this 5-minute area is essentially the main commercial hub of the larger region. So as we go down to that 15 minutes, you can see that number expands to $162.5 million in demand, $131.7 million of supply. Now that what you have here, this flips, so it goes $30 million, $30.8 million of opportunity gap. So this is $30.8 million every year goes somewhere else other than this 15-minute radius. So it's going, down to Saginaw. It might be online. It's going to, other places. When we expand it even farther, 45 minutes, that expands even farther. So you've got almost $500 million, a little more than $500 million worth of demand, $422 million worth of supply, and $130 million of economic opportunity. Now, what that means for OSCODA is inside each one of these this is the broad category. And as we go further in this process with the downtown plan and with the academic development strategies, we're going to outline more. Just because that there is a gap or a surplus here, that there is opportunity within those. So it breaks down into individual sectors. So,
and let me jump in real quick. If you feel like he's speaking a foreign language, when he says demand, then what that simply means is the consumers that live here spend this much money. And then when he says supply, that means the stores that exist here are reporting that much in sales. So the consumer expenditure model is built off of kind of a projection that's based off of demographics and sales trends and all those type things. And then the supply is really based off of a couple different factors, with the main one being tax reporting. So there's certain categories there, but so when he talks about leakage numbers, and when you talk about $30 million leaking in that 15-minute drive time, what I always like to tell people is that's money you don't have to invent. It's money that already exists, is simply being served in a different geography. And the mindset automatically jumps to, oh, well, they're spending it online. Percentages aren't really bearing out that I mean, they are spending online, but typically, and you guys are falling right in place with the standard percentages, about 10% of your overall retail market is making its way on.
Does seasonally, does it make an impact also, like winter to summertime?
So it's going to change your sales patterns, but all of these numbers are truly based off of the sales, the demand, the supply side is based off of reality. When you sit there and you start to look at some of the demand side, you can always have some fluctuations based off the expenditure models compared to, when you look at the real full-time residents versus the impact. But they use kind of a relationship between sales and purchasing to help build that model. So many times that does appropriately cover.
And we actually, and we have a number for that, by the way, too. The State Tourism Bureau tracks visitor spending on a county level basis. So if we were going to, draw an equivalent, it would probably be about that 15-minute would probably be the closest for us to be able to equate. And in retail expenditures, it's about $8 million a year. So when we see this 147 million, at most 8 million of that might be tourism spending. The rest is everyday resident spending.
Thank you.
I want to talk a little bit about industry. Obviously, I think one of the things that there's a predominant thought that this is the hub.
Can I interrupt you real quick?
By all means.
But before he goes on the industry, just so you know, as the process continues to move forward on the retail leakage and market component, one of the things that will come out of that is he was talking about whole market numbers. We're going to dig in a little bit deeper into individual categories, what types of business you're leaking in, and what leakage categories make the most sense for some of the vacant properties in your downtown. So again, what we're doing is we're starting to make some very market-driven, logical arguments to help put appropriate business types into vacant properties. So we're giving you the 40,000 foot view, and it's going to get deeper and more detailed to arm you with information to make more strategic decisions.
So and package that to potential businesses.
Exactly. Well, and I would say first with the existing businesses. So you guys already have, a group of businesses who are within the township, and supporting them with that data is, I think, the first goal, because the first rule in sales is you want to keep the customers that you have. So if we're thinking of the township as a business, those existing businesses are already your customers. Can we help them potentially expand if an existing business has an idea about something else that they want to do, and the data helps support that? Then we'd rather have them expand within the township before we look to bring in somebody else. Thanks for that. That's important, because we are kind of giving you a fire hose of data here, and I want to be clear about how we're using that, and I think Ben just did an excellent job of explaining how we're kind of drill down into what's appropriate on that. So let me transition into industry. I think one of the things that, again, as I started to say, that it's believed that this is where a lot of people come to work, and there are a lot of people that come to work, but as we looked at some of that census data, we're actually seeing more people leave the township than people who come in to work on a daily basis. So 631 people more leave than come in daily for work in the township. That's, I think, a little bit of something that we want to make sure that we kind of pointed out, because I think I believe that this is where everyone comes. There's a lot of people who come here. Obviously, 1,000 people come in every day, but 1,600, almost 1,700 folks leave every day too. So they're going other places. Wanted to show this chart. Again, we have a lot of data, and I don't mean for it to be a fire hose of data, but This is really based on estimates from 2018 about the number of businesses, the percentage of what they make up versus the number of employees. And obviously, the big dog here is transportation. Kalita and those surrounding businesses make up, and again, we know that this 1,022 number is an old number. It was 13 something as of 1326 as of last Friday. But even though that as a percentage of businesses, the transportation sector makes up 4.7% of the businesses in the township, it represents almost a third of the employment. So obviously it's an important thing, but I also want to show that as a context in terms of what that means for the rest of the jobs in the area. The services, and when they see summary, it's because underneath that there's between 6 and 12 additional lines of subcategories that fall under that. So services would be things like the restaurant industry, hotels, those sorts of things. So that service industry represents about almost a third, about almost 30% there. And then from there, you're looking at, it drops off pretty quickly, to be honest. You got 24% after that in terms of the retail trade. So that's typical retail sales. That's where the majority of the jobs are coming from. So you've got the big, vast majority of that in transportation, and then after that, you're looking at the services, and then after that, you're looking at retail trade. Now, one thing that we do know from a wage standpoint, these are way higher paying than those next two levels. So we want to talk a little bit about what we see as potential targets and actions coming forward. Anything that Kalita does in terms of expansion, as a key employer, we think that's important to support as part of all this. The Michigan Launch Initiative, following through on those things. By the way, some of this may not sound like, excuse the term, rocket science, but taking care of what you have, I think, is really important. But pursuing stuff like this, the Launch Initiative, I will tell you, I think is a really cool opportunity. But the way that the number of things that could go wrong in that process is many, and I don't mean that's not on the township. That's everything else that goes into something like we're talking about commercial spaceport type of stuff. That it's important to realize that you have perspective on it. You did say that was going to fall off, and you were right.
And I will say, as we go through this process, one of the things that you might pick up on, and I think it's fair to say out loud, the commercial spaceport concept is one that it's almost like it's either going to happen or it's not going to happen, and it's not the will of the citizens that will determine whether it happens or not. It's an industry driven and a state level and a national level thing. And I think that one of the biggest things that we want to be aware of as we go through this plan is we certainly don't want anyone here to feel like the future of the township hinges on a commercial spaceport. There are a lot of people that are still very much stuck on this idea that sounds a little too Jetsons, and we're losing our mind if we put all of our eggs in that basket. And I get that mindset. I mean, I think there's a tremendous amount that the community continue to focus on, understanding that this is it's a very relevant initiative based off of assets that you have. But you also want to keep those locals moving along with you and be able to talk about the things that they understand and want to be a part of it. So it's there. It might feel like we're glossing over it, but I feel like that's kind of an engine that's working on its own, if that makes sense.
And Joe forwarded me a report that shows United States for spaceport operations. This is from PricewaterhouseCoopers, and it was pretty recent. United States is the #1 country for spaceport operations, all right? And then on a state level, Michigan's #4, all right? And they have many different factors into that, including the state tax code being one, all right? So Michigan is 4th. In California and Washington, we're above, and I forget the 3rd state above. But we're up there, all right? But we are not solidified as, yes, we are definitely where this thing is going. All we can do is try and grow.
I'd say you're a contender, but maybe not necessarily a favorite. So I think it's important to have that perspective. Again, going back to the best customers, the customer you already have, making sure that, and I know you guys are looking at the potential of having an economic development position or contract to do that. But one of the fundamental parts of economic development is our retention and expansion visits. So working with the existing industry, learning about what it is that they need and working with them and overcoming those barriers. Attraction efforts, again, this is the blocking and tackling of economic development. So making sure that sites are properly marketed, getting them up on the website, and you guys have already started to put together packages. You guys have been working with the MEDC on that, continuing that, and going down that path. I want to talk a little bit about something that kind of stuck out to us over the last couple of days, and one of those things is that kind of entrepreneurship feel. It doesn't feel like there's a ton of entrepreneurs here. And some of that, goes back to, you look at, the major employers, Kalita, a lot of the people who come here are single guys. They're not necessarily having their spouses come in tow. And there's not an additional group that helps do kind of entrepreneurship, people who have a spouse with a secure income and they can take a chance. But what we do think is that in order to kind of grow the local wealth within the community, that there has to be more entrepreneurship from the folks who are here. Economic development isn't just about going and getting new plants or new things coming from the outside. It's about growing the entrepreneurs that we have within the community. And if we're looking at, and all these things, quite by the way, are tied, whether it's industry, the entrepreneurship, and even when we're looking at the vacancies within the commercial districts, that there has to be, this wealth of folks that can kind of step in and create businesses. We need that across our downtowns. So we have identified a couple of easy steps. The first is the small business and education training. So SBDCs have regional offices around, bringing them in once a month, once every other month, to work with potential folks who are looking at creating businesses, people who have ideas, using those free resources as a way to do that, to do those types of trainings. Creating a revolving loan fund. Now, as I typed this, I heard Aaron's voice in my head saying, "We're not a bank, we don't do loans, that's not what we're good at." I don't know if you've ever said that, but I heard that guidance in my head after talking. But you do have banks, you do have the IOSCO EDC, and we're going to dig in a little bit more detail over the next month or two and figure out, is there a way to have a partnership there where a revolving loan fund, and I know IOSCO County EDC has a revolving loan fund, but what sources are out there? We know USDA has sources for a revolving loan fund, so we're going to dig in a little bit more deeper in that and figuring out how can we partner to be able to help create a revolving loan fund to help with startups and with small businesses.
Targeting the county EDC to get them motivated to do what they've done for 25 years.
Right.
It's a feat, but if it can be accomplished, that's pretty significant.
Absolutely.
Right.
Absolutely. And one of the things, Joe mentioned USDA, one of the programs I threw his way is there's a program that they have called Red Leg. And Red Leg is intended to be able to fuel a local government with the ability to partner with a private sector project, fund up to $300,000 of that project at no interest or low interest. When the loan is repaid, it's repaid to the township, and then the township gets the ability to decide how that $300,000 gets reused, whether it is now in a revolving loan fund, whether it then goes into a forgivable loan for a catalyst project or things like that. So there are some very interesting opportunities to be able to tap into that, but I think that, again, as we're going through this process, we continue to kind of run ourselves through this filter. We're a township government, we're not a city government. There's a difference in what the taxes you can levy, and that's on purpose, so that there's a certain amount of what you should be doing or shouldn't be doing, and we're trying to be really logical about all those recommendations.
And when you dive into that, please look at Iosco County. They're kind of unique that they provide no resources to Michigan Works.
Right.
They provide no resources to, say, a regional approach developed by OSCO, for example.
Right.
There's no funding source provided by the county for any regional collaboration and economic development activities.
Right.
If we're going to do it, we got to do it. They're not.
Well, and what they may be is a good vehicle to be able to help do that. Because again, if the township's position is that you guys shouldn't be in the business of doing it, that's fine. You need a partner though that can do that, and that's one of the things at least they have is that vehicle. So we're going to dig in a little bit more and figure out what their capacity level is to do that, and or working with banks. I will tell you that we successfully got a USDA RD loan when I was in Shiawassee County for a revolving loan fund. We got a $100,000 grant. Our committee was not the chamber employees. We were part of it, but the committee was made up of the commercial lending officers of the 5 banks in town. So they were all part of that. We were tapping into that. And that's actually how we secured the grant, because we were able to demonstrate to the USDA that we had the right people at the table to help make decisions. Vacancy awareness. I'm willing to bet that all the locals know where all the vacant buildings are. But if you were a prospective business person, you don't have any detail on any of that, any of those buildings, unless you happen to know them personally and have some sort of interaction. So creating awareness about what those potential vacancies are. One of the things that we also have identified as a potential in this is, actually this goes into vacancy, I'll talk about that in a minute. And then explore the possibility of rent reduction programs. So, I think that there's a challenge here, because we've got building owners who may have an unrealistic expectation of what their rents are worth, but we also may have an opportunity or a situation where prospective businesses may not be able to afford all of that rent. So we might want to look at some creative ways to look at that. One of the things that Ben suggested was working with the property owners at doing a weighted rent scale. So in the summertime, when business is good, rent is more. In the wintertime, rent is lower because business is lower. So working at some of those, it doesn't have to be one set mortgage rate the whole way through.
And I think a lot of times communities are really hesitant to pursue anything that has anything to do with supplementing rent cost. But I guess first of all, you always have the dynamic of the carrot and the stick, and it's like before you can wield the stick, it's nice to have some sort of carrot to be able to, incent appropriate behavior. But the other thing that's interesting there is you can get really, really intelligent with rent programs. I've worked with some communities that have offered 12-month free rents. So it's the type thing where it's like, we are trying to push longevity. I've heard too many stories in this community about a business that tried to open and close 2 months later. If you're only open for 2 months, there's no way in the world you were ready for what you were doing. And unfortunately, when that business closes, nobody says, oh, I bet they didn't have a well-vetted business plan. They blame it on the marketing, and they say, see, I told you that wouldn't work here. But I mean, it's one of those dynamics where being able to even offer the smallest of strategic incentive, it kind of gets you into the conversation. And if you're offering some sort of incentive, then now all of a sudden, you kind of have the ability to say, you're actually significantly overpriced on this property because the foot traffic doesn't match up with your rent rates. So it gets you in that
and there's nothing that necessarily says that you have to be the ones that provide that either. In Howell, Michigan, Lake Trust Credit Union partnered with the Howell DDA there, and they created a program where the credit union actually is doing the subsidy of those rent rates. So there's that possibility as well. Want to move on to housing. Probably should have led with housing, mainly because we all know it's one of the biggest issues that this community faces. It wouldn't necessarily matter how successful a lot of the industry is if we can't put people, everywhere. So one of the things I wanted to share with you is the number of housing units from 2010 to today to what's projected for 2024. And again, I'll try my best to explain it because it's hard to see the numbers along the side. But you're just about 5,800 units, give or take, within 100 units between last 9 years and the next 5 years. You can see the growth rate is probably about a sliver. What I also wanted to show you was the breakdown of owner-occupied, renter-occupied, and vacant. And vacant is the purple. Is the red. And technically, vacancies these would be probably second and or third homes, so vacation homes. Your housing supply isn't necessarily bad. You don't have a lack of supply. What you have is a lack of full-time residents. What you have is a lack of owner-occupied. Because you have housing availability, it's just tied up with secondary homeowners. But when you look at this, one of the charts I want to point out here is your vacant housing units exceed your owner-occupied. You have more vacation homes than you have full-time residences. That's very difficult to deal with as you're looking at trying to grow that market. So I want to be clear as we talk about the housing that is a significant portion of your housing stock. And I think people know that, this isn't a shock to anybody saying that the second home market is a big part of your, I don't know if you guys have ever realized how big it is. And it's bigger than your owner-occupied.
Now, can I ask a question?
Sure.
Where did you get the information that indicates what percentage of it was rentals?
So this is from Esri. So it's a national database, and it uses census information and then projected forecasts based on their modeling.
Okay.
So we haven't done a detailed property analysis for the last 19 years. This is based off of a national database who does this projection forecasting for every community in the country.
Nancy's the assessor, she's the one gonna give you that spreadsheet.
Yep. So we're gonna dig into more detail on that
Okay.
as we look at this. But looking at this is what we're seeing. I think when we take a look at their zip codes and where those are being sent to, that will give us a good idea as well in terms of secondary homeowner versus primary
Now,
homeowner.
is there a way to compare, because a lot of them, you're gonna probably have a fair number of them that the people don't live in the home, but they're renting it out, they're renting that
Right.
house out to someone. Is there a way to?
We won't be not from your tax rolls. We won't be able to figure out who's rental and who's not.
Is there a way to cross-reference that, for example, with the voter registration list as to who's registered to vote at a specific address?
There may be if we can get that information.
And I'm trying to think, because a lot of times, a vacation rental is gonna fall into a vacant category, where a full-time rental is gonna fall into the rental category. So technically, they're both units that are being used for rental, but it's because one rental generates a resident while the other rental doesn't, where they're falling into that category. So hopefully, as we dig deeper, we will be able to get a little clarity on it.
Okay. Thank you.
So I want to really kind of clarify too, what we see as kind of four housing markets. There is the single family year round, there's a multifamily year round, there's a single family seasonal, and then the seasonal rental. Ben just alluded to this. What we really want to focus on to start is multifamily, and then creating a pipeline into single family. So what we're hearing over and over again is that we're getting folks in here for 12, 18 months. We're going through the process. There isn't stable housing for them to stay here. It doesn't make them feel at home here. They don't feel secure in bringing their family up here. So not only are we losing this opportunity, we're losing this opportunity. So creating a multifamily opportunities for both investors and for potential residents to come in and establish themselves within the community will also open up a pipeline for after that 12 to 18 months. If they elect to stay here, then it helps create a larger single family market.
And just to be clear, or to reiterate, we have 4 housing types. These are not, this does not mean we're going out and actively pursuing development in all 4. It's more of a definition of the type. I think that Joe's exactly
Yes.
right. The single family year round and the multifamily year round are the targets. The others are actually issues that are, potentially working against us, in a multitude of different ways. But, they have a demand that's all its own, and we don't need to actively try to get more part-time residents. That's not going to prove to be overly beneficial. We need to focus in on the year-round as our housing target.
So when we talk about the actions related to that, we're recommending 2 tracks. So one is a product-based. So creating more multifamily, creating more single family, creating more upper floor for downtown. We had the opportunity to talk with one of the property owners downtown who's considering demoing a property, and we said, you need to make that 2 or 3 stories, and the response was, okay, let's talk about that. So creating that density also helps downtown, and I'll talk more about that in a second, but it also offers another type of product. So it's more rental. That we need to have, in my opinion, probably between 200 to 400 units as quickly as possible into the community in order to kind of handle the demand that we're seeing. The other part of this actually came up during our conversations, the idea, one of the challenges that everywhere in Michigan has, but particularly in the north, is attracting developers and attracting construction. And one of the suggestions that came up that we think is worth pursuing is looking at it from a regional perspective. Every community is kind of going out on their own trying to attract developers. If OSCODA can partner with the rest of the northeast part of the state, especially up the coastline, of working with those potentials for housing, that we can start to package these instead of trying to lure a developer from Detroit or from Saginaw or from Flint or Lansing to come up the coast, that maybe we could either, grow some of the construction industry within the region, or at least have those folks establish a base of operations within this region that's going to make construction easier for everybody, because it's something I think the region needs. The other side of this is programming. And we hadn't really talked about this with a lot of groups, but we see this as the potential for an opportunity. Every month, you guys, how many folks do you guys bring in on a monthly basis?
A lot.
A lot.
I don't know.
A couple dozen, maybe?
No, 50.
50? Okay. So 50 folks on a monthly basis. There is a constant churn just from this one organization, not everybody else, but let's if we were to include everybody else, let's say there's 50 to 60 people on a monthly basis that come into the community. One of the things, as your history is as a military base, this community historically has had a lot of churn of people coming in and out, because that's what military-based communities do. What you will have the opportunity to do, especially in that first 12 months of folks who are here for that, in that rental cycle, that you have the opportunity to welcome them as part of the community. I think what happens a lot of times is guys come in, they get a place to stay, they hear from the other guys that they're working with of where they should go, and that's about it. So we want to formalize that, working with potentially the Chamber and the CVB, to create a new resident onboarding process. So once a month, there is a new resident party that gets together and they explain, maybe buy a beer. We'll figure that out, I think, down the road a little bit more. But this idea of creating a more formal welcoming into the community of saying, we're glad that you're here. The first step in showing somebody you appreciate them is welcoming them. I think that it just kind of blindly happens that we have folks come into this. So having the chamber, having these partners do this, I think is incredibly important. Familiarization tours are part of this. Actually, the tourism industry uses, they shorten it, they call them FAM tours. They use these familiarization tours for travel writers and other folks to be able to have people understand what there is in the community to enjoy. We can do this with new residents, to plug them into all the assets that are here so they can understand kind of what's going on. The issue that we've heard over and over again is that the complaint is that there's nothing to do here. There is stuff to do here. It's being able to kind of help point it out. Locals know it, new residents don't. And nobody's telling the new residents about all the stuff there is. So formalizing that process. Again, I mentioned the monthly welcome event. This idea of formally welcoming them into the community and saying, thank you for being here, we want you to be here, how can we help? Yes?
I thought the chamber does have the welcome packets, or had put together some previous meetings.
I think they did in the past.
Yeah, but how do they know to stop there and get it?
I direct them there. A lot of people, when they come in to get their water turned on and stuff like that, I have information in our office, and then I also send them to the chamber. If they're not doing that anymore, then
Right.
get with them, because that's where I can send
Well, and that's right. I think that's the opportunity. I mean, because I think one of the hardest things to do is when they turn the water on is tracking how do they come in. So but we actually have one of the largest employers who does that on a monthly basis, being able to give us that information that we can say, here, welcome to the community. There's this thing that goes on once a month. We'd love to have you out there. And you can rotate it around the different restaurants, or you can rotate it around the different areas. But to actually start, and this is kind of the soft thing that people, I think have a hard time quantifying.
I'm fine with that. Our chamber doesn't go first.
Right.
I'm sorry.
Well, and I think, honestly, and that's where I think the CVB partnership comes in.
I would think them in I have that whole bookcase, and I see those people on a monthly basis.
Mhm.
And I have a map of all, going out River Road to all the different destinations. They ask me about things to do, this kind of stuff, and everybody knows.
My recommendation to the chamber and CBB was what I saw in another chamber. I travel a lot, across the country. I see what's effective and what doesn't.
Mhm.
One chamber has a very long rectangle sheet. They have a lot of activities in their town, so they put out
Well, and the other thing from when you talk about a new resident, that is a pivotal moment, that first 6 to 8 weeks of being in a community. And, when you sit there and you look at those numbers a little bit, you go from a retail gainer in a 5-minute drive time to a retail leader in a 15-minute drive time, and it just so happens that Walmart's 20 minutes away, right? So you get these people who come into the community, they don't know anything, and they're immediately needing to establish retail ties. They're creating a trade pattern, and then their motivation to explore their own community goes away. And we like to operate under this mindset that there's some sort of local obligation to explore your own community and support their businesses, but that's not how people actually work. So we have to proactively make those ties and those connections to the restaurants, to the businesses that we have. So all that stuff, I think, fits in together into that kind of residential transformation into the market. So it's not enough to have a warm body. We want to capture the economic impact.
And if Mark starts handing out 2-for-1 beers at the office, or Tate's or G's, you might get a couple of those guys to show up, right?
Yep.
All right, next thing I want to talk about is about micro retail and pop-up. I'm actually going to turn this over to Ben, who has done a ton of work in this area.
Yeah, so I think one of the big things, and I'll go through it pretty quick, I mean, the idea of micro retail, whenever I go into a downtown district and I see a high vacancy rate, one of the things that I automatically assume is there's a discrepancy between what the property owner thinks the property is worth and what a retailer needs and can afford to operate. So in America, the typical, more traditional retail space is about 1,800 square feet. And if you go through and you do kind of industry standard math, that means that in a typical community, you have to sell about $12,000 worth of merchandise a month simply to make the same as the lowest paid teacher. Okay, so $160,000 in sales to bring home $35,000, and that's not achievable in most places. So one of the big things that we'll kind of get into is there is this difference between commercial rate and retail rate. That's a big, just understanding that it is a difference. The national average is literally $10 difference between a retail space and an office space. But when you're a property owner, for some reason they always think that their property is worth the higher, right? So one of the interesting things that we've done is my mom was a math teacher, so we went through the process and we did the math. In a typical traditional space, you need about $195,000 to have that space fully inventoried for a year. Nobody's going to be able to get that loan, right? But if you start to divide the space up, create smaller retail and possibly use some of the space in the back for office type use and then smaller retail use, if you just take a third of that space for back end office, that drops you from $195,000 to $97,000. And if you create a micro retail bay, now all of a sudden, even though you might be seeing an inventory turn that goes from 2 times a year to 6 times a year, you can start a business with 16 grand. And you can have a space that feels full. And when people walk the street, they don't ever walk by a business and say, wow, that business looks really shallow, but they sure pick up every time a business is vacant, right? So when you think about the IGA, for example, that's a really big square footage building for a downtown retail. It might be that the reuse of that doesn't need to all be retail, but you do want to preserve street front retail. So that's what this concept of micro retail is. How can we take advantage of small places to create opportunities for retail to actually exist and thrive in our community? It's almost the antithesis of an incubator. Incubators were intended to start small and have you grow big. Retail in 2019 has started to realize maybe grow big is not the answer. Maybe staying small is the key to being successful. Increase your inventory turns, keep your overall costs low. So this is a couple examples. This is in the community I live right now. This was an engineering firm in our downtown. So literally that entire space feels dead to the pedestrian, and the whole space to the left, these were 3 different offices that were vacant because the engineers said they were too hot because they had windows. Apparently engineers like it dark, right? So what do you do with that space? We simply showed them how they could change up that space, recapture those 3 offices into 3 different businesses, and now all of a sudden that block goes from feeling kind of dead, even though the space was occupied, to now feeling more vibrant, more dense. You have these big square footage buildings. Sometimes we have this skating center showing how you can take advantage of that space and use it for smaller, more feasible type developments. I mean, one of the things that stuck out to me was we sit there and we talk about, oh, we need a big business there, a big building there. The space in front of the graphic design firm, the little long space. Does everybody know what I'm talking about? If you're looking at the IGA, then the parking lot entrance, and then I think it's right there. You've got this really interesting space for some sort of activity. You know, there could be some interesting little units there. So what we actually did was we created this concept of what we call tiny shops. They're modular retail units that are designed to be 1, 2, and 3 parking spaces. So literally you could go in and you could have retail density that you infuse in very small spaces, and you start to create opportunities for people to affordably start a business and be able to create more retail opportunities for your customers to interact with.
Wildwood Lake actually has done this with just sheds.
Yep.
It's very low tech.
It was actually, we designed these as part of a response to Hurricane Katrina and figuring out how Waveland, Mississippi, their infrastructure was completely decimated. They wanted to reestablish retail ties, but they had 3 years worth of underground infrastructure to be able to do before their downtown could reemerge. So we started to use these structures to kind of stimulate that growth. And when you have kind of a beach cottage feel coming into the community, these small structures are architecturally appropriate to your community already. So it fits in really, really nicely there. So you can kind of see how they develop. These are a couple that you see all throughout the community. Of course, everybody knows about shipping container parks. I include this simply to say shipping containers can be appropriate, but please don't do that because you think it's clever. You know, these have now been used enough that it's like, figure out what makes sense for your community, what's appropriate for your community, and then introduce those low-cost opportunities for people to put their toe into the business.
So we want to address tourism just a little bit. You'll see, I think, when we come down to the vast majority of the recommendations, this is a very small part of it. But one of the things that really struck us as we talked to the small businesses, they said, if you don't make your money in the 3 or 4 months of the summertime, then you're not going to survive the wintertime. And to us, that's really impactful. So you guys do rely a good deal, especially on your retail, on tourism. And so we wanted to provide just 2 recommendations about how to kind of work that. Last thing we want to do is say you need more people here in June, July, and August. I don't think anybody really particularly cares for that idea. But one of the things we talked about was extending the shoulder seasons, is doing more to market the area in the springtime and especially in the fall. You guys have amazing color up here of using those spaces more and getting more folks, and in particular group tours. As we talked to the Convention and Visitors Bureau, I was a little surprised that the community doesn't pursue group tours. So these are the buses that come through that have tourists from all over the Midwest and all over. I mean, we've seen busfuls of German folks. I will tell you that having done the economic development strategy up in Newberry in the Eastern UP, it's easier to get hotel space in July and August than it is September and October. Because, and I asked them, I'm like, who's coming up here in September, October? Because first thing, we talked to several of the hoteliers here, is it's starting to slow down because the kids are going back. Response was, everybody else who doesn't have kids. This is the time when, these are the folks who are going out in September and October. So I think that's largely ignored by your tourism efforts here within the community. So it's something that we're making that recommendation of going after group tours and marketing the area more in the fall, especially to be able to get more folks in during that time to be able to help support that retail, so retail can be successful and stay open year round.
I had a hell of a time last fall trying to get on the River Queen to go, see, I had parents in town hours at noon and then, you know, in the evening, and I call to make a reservation, and then they call back and say it's canceled, we don't have enough people on the boat. Like 3 different times until I just gave up. We get a bus full of people on the River Queen, maybe we'll stop at Desi's and have a taco and a margarita afterward, right? Like, we have those opportunities, we have to be able to
And
manage that.
be able to bring them in on a Monday, a Tuesday, a Wednesday, a Thursday, you know, not just the Friday, Saturday, Sunday, but being able to bring those group tours in midweek is
And
going to
this-
help a ton.
And the CVB is like, those are the best type of travelers. Because they don't have kids and they have disposable income, right? If they're coming, they don't have kids, they're looking to spend money because they're not spending back to school shopping, right?
The
So-
phrase, if you guys have ever heard it, they're called DINKs, double income, no kids. And those are those spenders who spend the most.
So in regards to what he just said here about them canceling their tours, how do you convey to business owners that sometimes you've got to lose money to make more money later? I mean, I ran my own business here, and there were sometimes I had to lose money in order to gain additional customers later.
Right.
That happens a lot with extending hours. Is that people say, well, we tried extending our hours till 7, 8 o'clock. We did it for 2 weeks, and we didn't make any extra money. So
Yeah, I think one of the big things is when you identify, I mean, that's a perfect example. You know, if you have a particular tour operator who is, their practices are unreliable, then you'd love to be able to just say, look guys, from a business standpoint, you just need to push through this. You had some reservations. You are hurting everybody by canceling those tours. They'll say, yeah, well, that's fine, but you're not paying my bills. But the other side of that conversation is what can we do to help work with them to try to create that? You know, Joe said extended hours. You know, I'm a big believer in moving towards extended hours, but I also think that it takes years to change consumer behavior, and it takes a true concerted effort and a realistic expectation of how to get there. So, you know, with something like the tours, how can we have the CVB go through and target group tours, generate customers for them, so that we now have truly earned the ability to say, look guys, you canceling the tours is really hurting the whole visitor story here. So, you know, how can we work to make that a little bit better?
Well, saying the group tours actually help combine with that, because you can actually say, instead of saying, well, we're going to do this tour and hope that people show up, you say, no, we've got 40 people booked for this already. So getting that, getting some of the stuff like that, like the group tours on board, helps kind of make that case. Say we're going to have folks to, and I know we're maybe halfway through all of our slide deck, but I want to take just 1 second more too, and I think part of that is looking at the extended hours thing is Ben talked about a concentrated effort. It doesn't say we want you to open every night, 7 nights a week until 8 o'clock. It's we're going to do an event on Thursday night, and we're going to do it in this area, and we'd love for you to stay open that night until 8 o'clock. So it's trying to bring people along and giving folks a reason to get down there before you can actually, as Ben said, it takes years to get people used to that, but you can kind of move folks in that direction. So I want to transition to the strategic communications plan. This also includes the community marketing strategy. Really, we're looking at 4 main targets here. Notice tourists isn't necessarily on this. We're looking at the residents of potential residents, so those renters, the potential homeowners, and then conversion of snowbirds, folks or vacationers who've bought a second home, developers, so home builders, current property owners, and multi-use developers, businesses, so entrepreneurs, industry expansion, and then networking strength. So this also kind of brings in some of the other organizations like the Chamber of Commerce in on this idea, and then the locals. So the folks who are here, they've been here. I think a lot of times we have a tendency to ignore the folks who are here. We want to focus on everybody on the outside. So we want to make sure that we're communicating to folks and talking about some of those things like local pride. The thing that we heard over and over again too is the environmental awareness piece about PFAS. I think we need to make sure that we're addressing that as we talk about the strategic communications plan.
And just to be clear, that obviously the visitor and the tourist is a market. It's a huge market, but there is a dedicated organization with dedicated funding to cultivate that market, and that's the CBD. Like, they get lodging tax to do that job. So when we're really talking about those 4 main audiences, those are the target audiences of the township and helping the township to achieve economic and strategic goals. So that, I want to be very clear why they're not in there. I think most people think marketing, target audience, visitor, and that's kind of their logic, that logical pattern. So that's why they're not on there.
And I just wanted to show you, this is a preliminary draft of what we call a strategic communications plan. It talks about what we'll do is we'll work with the township to identify some of the specific goals and objectives which have already been identified through the strategic plan. And then we'll talk about some of the primary messaging around that of saying, when we talk about the township, how do we want to talk about? What are the goals that we're trying to achieve whenever we do this? So that means anytime there are press releases, anytime that there's media alerts, anything else that the communication that the township does, who they do it to and why they do it and how frequently they do it. Because I think a lot of times we're very reactionary on things. When something goes wrong and there's a PFAS issue, you better believe that they're at the front door, right? But it's when other things are going positively, if there's a new business in town, any of that stuff that the township can help bring attention to, that you can do that. This is the part I like.
All right, so I'm going to go quick. So from again, everything that you're seeing, we've done since a very pleasant meeting last night. So we're working really, really fast on this stuff. But when we go into a community, one of the first things we do from a branding perspective is look at all the different things that exist. And from a standpoint, from kind of the top level, you've got chamber identity, CVB identity, township identity, school. Those are kind of the main ones that all share the same name, right? One of the things that is very, very important here is the community went through a process where they developed and implemented wayfinding signage. That wayfinding signage is prevalent throughout the community. It was a joint wayfinding project with 2 townships. As you go through and make branding recommendations, you have to be remarkably sensitive to the fact that there is a look, a feel, and an implemented investment throughout the community. It's not just downtown, it's not just one township. So we wanted to make recommendations that were mindful that this look and feel and investment was there, but then also added additional tools to the toolbox so that we can truly be effective across the board. So it's not about, hey, we're going to delete everything we've done and start fresh. That's not how community branding works. I've never worked anywhere that had that kind of budget. You know, this is branding through inspiration, not branding through mandate. That's what makes community branding different from corporate branding. So we looked at all these kind of things. The first thing that we did was we really developed a color palette. We wanted to have a color palette that was a connective color palette through all the things that we did. I really picked colors that made sense based off of what everybody else was using. Believe it or not, you do not have to use the exact same colors as your high school to be your community branding colors. There's this weird thing that happens when the football team is bad and therefore community pride goes low. Like you want to have a little separation. So you incorporate them, but you have more. The colors aren't going to look good on the screen, but what we did is we selected a dark blue, a light blue, a nice rich green, and a nice warm gold. But then we actually selected 2 standard gradients. One was a warmth gradient and one was a cool gradient. And again, you can kind of tell things look completely different on the screen than they do on the computer. Much richer, much more vibrant. Then from there, we really dig into the typeface, selecting a typeface that you can use to connect the dots. Now, you are the home of Paul Bunyan. You do not have to have a typeface that looks like logs. You know, this is not about themes. You're a historic community. That doesn't mean that you have to have some sort of papyrus or, you know, old. This is about connection and expansion. It's not about trying to infuse every bit of character that you think the community has into the typeface. So we wanted to select one that was very clean, very easy to read, but had a couple features that allowed us to kind of customize it. When looking at your name, you've got a really beautiful name, the letters, the way that they relate to one another. So this is what it looks like in the typeface, but going through and taking a typeface and then creating what we call a word type, where we actually customize it. We created a custom C. We nest the O and C together so that they fill like they go together. And what you're doing is you're creating consistency in the simplest possible way. This is clean, it's easy to use, and it's the kind of thing that people can integrate into what they're doing. So we've already seen the signs throughout that feature this kind of yellow canoe on a blue background, yellow paddle. You can take that, you can incorporate that in, and automatically you have a connection. But it needs to expand from there. Again, you have a story that is so dynamic it cannot be simplified with a paddle. You need to be able to tell more. We did the branding for Grayling. Grayling was perfectly fine with the paddle. Grayling doesn't have, a place that has more 747s in the same place than anybody else, and, the former base of a global B-52, there's a lot of cool stories here. So being able to kind of factor those together, as we were here over the past 3 days, we tried to listen a lot, and one of the things that leads us to do is create what we call a brand statement. So it's a quick narrative that I want to read for you. Just up Michigan's Sunrise Coast, past the speeding interstate, is a community where vacations begin and never end. A place where the sun is served fresh daily. A place where people came because of the land and stayed because of the water. A place that defended our country and protected our globe. A place where the legend of the lumberjack was born. A place where life on these sandy beaches thrives through all 4 seasons. We are OSCODA, and we are proud of this place we call home. This place where opportunity truly exists. We invite you to spread your wings and take flight. And so what that does is that kind of comes together into what we're recommending as almost more of an economic development brand, per se. We have a place identity that is really kind of factored around outdoors, natural resources, and those outdoor experiences. But we need to have this clean, progressive economic development brand. Everything from our Air Force Base history to the industry that exists now to the potential future with the spaceport and all of those investments that could go on. But then also taking that simple concept and taking it out to, this is the perfect place to try to start a business. This is the perfect place to take flight, to truly live life the way that you intend to live it. So it gives us that clean opportunity. We've got a reference to the land, a reference to the lake, a reference to both outdoors in plane or bird, depending on what you see. The stylized O that also kind of features the sunrise side. So in a very, very simple icon, we're able to hit on a lot of different storylines. And I think one of the things that a mistake that communities often make is they assume that their community logo should be completely and totally self-explanatory. And I find that to be a wrong litmus test. I want a logo and a brand system to be a springboard for storytelling. I want it to have a lot of different angles in it so people can kind of tell that story. But if we stopped here, we wouldn't have all the pieces that we need. So being able to go through, being able to see it has a lot of different versatility from a design standpoint. You can go horizontal, you can stack it. How do you address Paul Bunyan? Being able to have your own custom, buffalo check plaid that's your colors. Being able to incorporate this from a merchandising standpoint and an event standpoint, but not overly invested from a community, a government, or an economic development standpoint. If you walk in to a meeting with a corporation that wants to invest $7 million and you put a plaid business card down, you're not necessarily having the kind of dialogue that you want. So being able to make these available to the business community to profit from this kind of stuff, consumers like that connection. But you also have this weird dynamic of sandy beaches and Paul Bunyan. So it leads a little bit of an intrigue there. From the CVB standpoint, I really think that one of the great things we could see from the CVB is a transition into more of being known as Visit. A lot of CVBs are starting to do that. We heard people over the course of the past couple days say, well, we're a VB because we don't really have conventions. I get that. But what you see here is you see an adoption of the word type and an incorporation into the pre-existing wayfinding signage. They're the ones that are telling the visitor's story. and then that visitor story will be repeated upon arrival in the physical place. They're the ones that can take that simple naturally tagline and they can go through and they can build additional meaning into that. It makes a lot of sense. We also understand that the CVB is a regional CVB. It's an interesting dynamic though, because their name is not OSCODA Osable, it is OSCODA area. So being able to truly just adopt this visit OSCODA it's not leaving, our neighbors behind. So I think that's one of the things we have to be sensitive to. It's preserving an investment, but then really capturing it into that visitor category. Updating and cleaning things like the chamber, where they can adopt colors, they can adopt typeface, they can give themselves a refresh, but be able to still kind of fit in. Take these brand components and have them make their way into the events that you go on. So you got this great event that just happened this past weekend. Again, leaning on that connective tissue of the typeface, your school district. Even we see them make their way into the school teams and the academic. Again, instead of using everything that the school had to be the thing that dictates our look and feel, it's almost turning that around a little bit, where we're showing how they can connect from a standpoint. But then taking this design, that simple icon, and tying it into some of our initiatives. We know we talk about residents. We know we talk about this housing strategy. We want to launch this Welcome Home initiative where we're truly focusing on connecting new residents, recruiting developers, building housing stock, so it all starts to fit in together. So that's where we're kind of moving from a branding standpoint. And then from there, I want to hit a little on the redevelopment plan, and I'm going to let, you talk about market segmentation real quick, and then I got a couple at the end, and then we'll wrap it.
So for the next 2 hours, I'm going to talk about the downtown plan. We are getting close to the end, I promise. I want to talk a little bit about the downtown redevelopment plan. So this is going to actually be kind of a subcomponent of the economic development plan. One of the things that we've heard over and over and over, whether it's from a potential resident standpoint, whether it's from an industrial standpoint, whether it's from even the business standpoint, is there's not a lot to do downtown. And we know that OSCODA is bigger than just the downtown, but that is oftentimes the barometer that people use to judge the health of a community. What I want to talk a little bit about was your market segmentation. This is going to be a lot of fun because we're going to talk a lot about numbers. I'm kidding. What I wanted to do is, as we do the downtown redevelopment plan, we're going to use that the retail leakage data that we talked about earlier, and we're going to use what's called market segmentation. If you're not familiar with the term, it is basically one of, I'm trying to remember how they have 70 different tapestry segmentations. It's a psychodemographic categorization of the folks, of how people live. So there's about 70 of them, cover the entire country. And what we did was we pulled that for the 5-minute, the 15-minute, and the 45-minute type of those drive times that we talked about earlier. And this kind of breaks down the major groups of folks who live in the area. And Ben and I were talking about this morning, and we do a lot of the tapestry and market segmentation stuff. And every once in a while we kind of think, man, how real is this stuff? And as we pulled it for OSCODA, one of the things that comes up is rural resort dwellers as one of the categories. We went, okay, it probably works. But what this allows us to do is it gives kind of a synopsis of the types of folks who live here, their neighborhoods, their economic traits, some of their market profile. So it'll help inform us a little bit better in terms of, it's not just necessarily, the retail leakage is part of that. It's how does the community behave as people? What's their lifestyles like? That will influence that retail gap. So if it says that there's a restaurant leakage of $1 million, is that a high-end white tablecloth? Or is that more of an everyday kind of diner? Is that more somewhere in the middle? Is it a brew pub? This type of information will help us be able to narrow down when we say that if there's $1 million worth of retail, that of restaurant leakage, they'll be able to help us try to figure that out a little bit better, to be able to help narrow things down.
And these are fascinating. They really are, because you can literally see, it's like rural resort dwellers was the #1 category in both the 15-minute and 45-minute drive time. On that second page of the profile, you literally see housing type, single family, seasonal. It goes in, it tells you what kind of magazines they read. You know, it's like, it is very, very insightful to take those personality types, fit in, and then also start to realize, okay, we understand what our major housing type or our major psychographic is, but we also understand these are the psychographics that we want to grow. Do we have the housing stock that they want to grow that market? Do we have the food type and entertainment that they want to grow that type of market? So it gives you a tremendous amount of insight to really make informed decisions about investments and the kind of things that you try to do in the community.
All right, so let's talk a little bit about downtown itself, the general downtown area. One of the things that we heard, I think, time and time again was, what downtown needs is more parking. This is all the available parking in downtown. This does not include the on-street parking that are along these areas. And these are the main thoroughfares, the corridors that connect US 23 to the beachfront. What we also want to do is we wanted to identify existing potential infill. So you'll notice that there's a couple of properties that's not on this list, a couple of big block size properties. We're not doing that right now. We're just looking at the existing infill opportunities. So there's a significant amount of opportunity to do additional development.
Back to the parking, you may be getting to this. We have, in my opinion, I think that proves it, a lot of parking downtown. Our problem is not a parking problem, it's a cultural problem. People don't want to walk.
Right. I always say you don't have a parking problem, you have a consumer motivation problem.
So how do we address that? How do we change the way people think?
One of the things, it's not included in this, and one of the things that I like to include in a lot of downtown plans, especially here in Michigan, is integration of the cycling infrastructure. You have a couple of bike racks downtown. You've got, I think, 2, and they're in pretty crappy shape in bad locations. But this idea of being able to help incent people to come down in other ways. And I will tell you that the older generation, that boomers, want to be able to drive and park downtown, but Xers and millennials, and by the way, Gen Z's now starting to make more decisions on this stuff with their parents as well as they're coming along, they want to be able to walk, they want to be able to bike to downtown. And that's full-time resident. By the way, one of the things I probably will put on there was as we went cruising around yesterday afternoon, and we were out by Kalita and the rest of the industrial spot, is the bikes at the bike racks out in the industrial areas. There is probably no shortage of between 15 and 20 bikes on any of those bike racks. So giving people an alternative to parking is also going to be an issue, but it's not an issue of parking.
And I will say, I think one of the biggest things that we try to do with the parking conversation is people immediately go to parking problem, parking capacity. We need more capacity. Let's knock down some buildings and make some more parking lots. Honestly, the cheapest solution I have ever seen is we create these little business cards that have this very map on it with all the parking lots highlighted, print a couple thousand of them, give them away to the downtown business owners. The reason why we hear so many complaints is because a person thinks that they should be able to park immediately in front of the business. They can't. They park, they walk into the business, and then they complain to the business owner. So in theory, the system actually worked. They're just angry about it. And the business owner has absolutely no way to respond. So they're left to commiserate. We simply do these cards. It's like, hey, these are all the parking spots. Sorry that you didn't have a good time this time. Check out any of these next time you're here. And it kind of alleviates a lot of the problem. And then just understand that a certain amount of the parking complaint is a growing pain. It's a market-driven indicator. If you have people who expect to be able to park directly in front of the business they're going to, then that means that your district has not achieved destination status. There's certain businesses that you need to have a good, well-thought-out parking management strategy for. If you have a pharmacy in your downtown, you want to make sure that there's spaces close to that pharmacy that turn over regularly so elderly can park and run in and grab their prescription and things like that. But it's not jumping to capacity being the solution, but instead making sure that you're handling awareness and management first.
And the other part I think is a caveat on this is that these are not all publicly owned. And that's one of the complaints is that some of the private parking owners don't want to let other folks use it. And I think that's something that we're going to need to address as we go further down this. But you know, the amount of supply is not necessarily the issue.
That's my main question, looking at all the coloring there. Very few of it's actual public parking. So like you have the township parking behind the township hall, right?
Right.
See that's highlighted there?
That's public.
So
No, I
here,
understand it's public, but let me ask you a serious
here,
question.
nope, right here, sorry, right there, right here,
In between there.
right here,
Down one,
here.
or maybe down one
Well,
more.
where, the one that he just did, the small one across from the township, what are you counting that as?
That's actually a private one, isn't it, with the,
It's the bank,
yeah, it's the bank.
right? So I mean, that's not public, and the bank won't let you park there, they were gonna buy the building next to it, and they wouldn't. let
This
you
is,
park.
yeah, this is the bank right, this is the one in the bank.
Not
Oh,
that
oh,
bank.
one. Right
Yeah,
there.
so that's definitely not public, and they will tell you
I'll
for
show
sure.
you that's on.
This one, sorry, this was the one I meant, sorry.
Yeah.
This is the
So
one that's-
IGA one looks like this. I guess
Right.
where I'm going with that is you already said it, but most of what you have highlighted there is privately owned.
Right.
So most people aren't gonna go park in a fancy parking lot, even though it's huge, with the, you know.
Well, and that's where I think we're gonna need to dig in over the next month.
And
and a half.
Gilbert's is the other huge one they
Yeah,
got there, and
Gilbert's
that's
is
not owned by
private.
the township at all, and they won't let public people park there.
Right.
So when you tell me whether I'm crazy on this or not, but again, I don't see capacity for parking being the problem. Like you said, it's motivation. People wanna park right in the front door, get in the business, and they complain. You go to any other town that has a good economy in it, you're not gonna find parking.
Right.
You're walking.
Right.
I don't see us having a parking problem, truly,
Right.
but I truly think we need a parking problem.
Exactly. That's your
That
goal.
means we're being successful.
Exactly. And the main thing that I like to illustrate with this, you're exactly right. There is more private parking than there is public parking. The community needs to see how much of their downtown space is dedicated to passive parking use. And then on top of that, they need to see that with restrictive private property practices, you're rendering 60% of your downtown non-contributing from any kind of real life because you have surface lots that people aren't allowed to use. Like, it's just one of those dynamics where it's like, for this community to thrive, you gotta get out of the mindset that you're in. And to be honest, we kind of gotta start to get the public, instead of being irritated that there's no parking, they probably need to be a little bit more irritated that private property owners are being less generous with use. I mean, there's a transition over time that needs to take place. There's a lot of parking that they don't need the whole space. You can reinforce some lines, you can reinforce some density while still keeping some pretty good capacity.
And if that business is open till 6 o'clock, if that business is open till 7 o'clock, after that, what's the point of?
What do they
being
care?
restricted on it?
Exactly. And we've all done that. We've all parked in a bank parking lot at 6:12 and wondered whether they were gonna tow you just because they were angry. You know, like, I mean, it's a true, that is true, and you know, you can only imagine what the visual impact to a person who's never been to the community before, who's slightly intrigued and wants to explore it, and continues to see signs saying, "Don't park here." I mean, that's not exactly the message we're looking for.
And how much land do you occupy that is vacant for 16 hours a day?
Exactly.
Just to reserve parking for a short portion of the day.
Right.
There's a lot of public parking that's not even identified on that.
Right.
So I want to show this. This is the overlay of all three of those graphics of what infill would look like in relationship to the rest of the downtown with the parking.
I also don't think it's labeled 100%. So the parking lot where the STS building is,
Yeah.
there's little, I don't know what they are, maybe 8-inch little signs on a couple places that show there's parking, because that parking lot's always empty. And the beach is overflowing, people are just parking on people's yards.
This line paintings on the roads.
That's the other one I was gonna
Parking
talk
on the
about.
sides,
So
yeah.
on all those side roads that you highlighted blue,
Yeah.
I mean, unless you are about 18 years old and have perfect vision, you can't see the white lines that allow you to park on them.
Or that you know that they're there, visitors have no idea.
Yeah, but they can be freshly painted and they can see, you know.
Well, and the other thing I'm just gonna throw I'm gonna throw it out there and say it out loud because I know of the conversation coming up with the community on the 28th. So you have a downtown district, and the downtown district is somewhat large, but it has two different feels to it. So from Division to Michigan, you have your main density. And then north of Michigan is where it's a historically residential feel and density that transition into business. So you have some houses used as businesses, and then you have some lots that have been converted into suburban style businesses in that downtown core. Not to say one's different or one's better than the other, they're both important to the overall feel, but just understand that the density that you have is really that division of Michigan. When you're looking at private sector investment, private sector multi-use development, that's going to be the area that you're going to want to focus in on, and you want to understand that you have a huge number of visitors that come to the community every year that enter the downtown through the entry sequence like they're coming from Old Orchard Park, which is a fantastic sequence as you come in and you see through that intersection and you see that flag and that that pavilion leading to the lake. That's a view that people take away with them. And then you also have the southern entry sequence coming north. So realizing that we're really focusing in on infill sites and denser development in that main core, and you have a little bit of a less dense section that connects into fertile. So that's all I'm saying about that. That's not weighing, it's not weighing in an opinion, it's just saying you've got two different kind of personalities going on there. But from there, we've got a couple action items we'd like to see in the downtown. First of all, the vacant buildings. We want to get vacant buildings filled, obviously, but we also want to clearly identify the difference between a vacant property that's available and a vacant property that's not. We heard that loud and clear. There are a couple property owners that have property but don't want to occupy the property. So being able to take that brand, get it out, that for sale and for rent signs don't send as positive a message on a vacant property as, imagine what this could be kind of thing. We see vacancy treatments where they'll take a storefront and they'll put up almost like a chalkboard and it just says, I wish I was, and people could write on there what kind of use they'd love to see. I mean, all different things that kind of make that interactive. And then an idea that Joe shared with the community when he was here last, the idea of a vacant building registry. The vacant building registry is a sequential tactic that is much more passive than eminent domain. It's easier to enact than a vacancy ordinance that immediately fines people for having a property that's vacant for a certain time period, but it starts to load a sequence of action with the mindset that the township has the right to make sure that the properties that are there are contributing to the economy. That a property owner, when they make a decision to allow a property to be vacant for a certain time period, they are detracting from the values of their neighbors. And there comes a certain standpoint and a certain time period where it should be okay for a community to say, you're not allowed to hurt everybody else. So it's a very sensitive way to get into that. A lot of communities go through facade improvement grants. They don't always have the catalytic impact that they were hoped to have. So one of the big things that we've seen lately is taking a facade grant program, breaking it down into what's called a component grant system, instead of just going out and saying, hey, we're offering a $2,500 facade grant. This year we say we're offering $500 grants for signage. Is your signage good? Is your signage in need for updating? Take this grant. Next year, $500 grant for awnings. How's your awning? Do you need a new awning? Do you need to enhance that? The next year, exterior lighting. Another thing that we're starting to see, just like talking about the micro retail, we're actually seeing communities offering what are called demising wall grants, where they're actually taking that facade grant money, they're offering property owners a grant to be able to subdivide that first floor space to be able to better utilize the space and generate revenue. Being able to focus in on business recruitment, bringing people into the community, traffic calming. I love the comment about the parking lines and not being able to see the parallel parking spaces. One of the things that we just introduced down in Ormond Beach, Florida, and they jumped on it, was we took their brand colors and we actually painted each one of the parking spaces just a solid color from their brand system. By doing that, what it does is it shrinks the roadway, makes people feel like they need to move a little bit slower while also clearly denoting where you can park. So it's this kind of interesting way to get brand identity and traffic calming all in one. We'd heard the talk about Gateway Arch, showing an example here. What I actually did is I actually took the exact curvature of the pavilion at the park and turned that into the shape for the arch. Your gut instinct might be that you want an arch on the highway, right, immediately as you cross over the river. From a logic standpoint, that makes the most sense. From an MDOT standpoint, it might not happen anytime soon. But you could imagine having an arch, in that eastbound perpendicular, enhancing that corridor and that kind of entry sequence to the beach might be an opportunity for you to kind of look at. And then I'm even showing some banner designs. You've got some really, really fantastic banners. They're very, very attractive. But one of the things that they do, because of the nature of the art that's on them, they create a little bit of activity instead of creating continuity. So as we look at those corridors, those perpendicular corridors, you might want to look at solid color background banner designs so that as people are driving past, you get the single color continuity along those corridors to give you the impression that you're passing by somewhere that you should explore. Where everybody knows when they drive past East Tawas, their downtown street, because they feel that density. You can replicate that density with banners as you're building that real density with occupied retail space. And then public art, you've got a lot of art and murals throughout the community. Let's take the presence of how they are now. Let's introduce more that have a strategic purpose of connectivity. There's a big push now of what they call horizontal art or rug art, where you're actually doing murals on sidewalks to motivate people to walk in a certain pattern of what you want them to explore. So think about ways that you might be able to do that kind of stuff. And then finally, explore opportunities that make sense for micro retail, explore opportunities in vacant space for seasonal pop-up shops so that you can take advantage of that space and get some activity soon.
So next steps, what we're going to do from here is we want to get some feedback from everyone here about what you've heard today, and then we're going to continue to ferret out some of the other information that we talked about earlier this morning, and be able to start to develop those more concrete written plans as we go forward. Our current timeline is that we'll probably come back, my guess is September, early October. Our goal is to have everything back to you guys by the end of October. I'd prefer actually mid to early if we could, but our guideline is to get everything by October. So based on what you've heard today, what do you think?
I love it.
I'm impressed.
I'm happy to hear, because so many people were like, we spent all this money on this other, with the wayfinding signs, and now they're gonna change everything, and you've incorporated it into, and explained it today, which, maybe we can put something like that on our Facebook page or something to let people understand that that's not the case, because there is a lot of that going on, so.
We've actually been recording the audio for this presentation. So if the township wants to share it, then they can do that with the
That
public.
would be great, but yes, I think it's fabulous.
I think it's beautiful, I think it's professional. Like you could talk about, it conveys a message, but not so specific that the people can form their own message what they want. this next to that.
And, oh, go ahead, I'm sorry.
I like that, it's up to each individual whether, the logo is a bird or a plane.
Right,
I love that.
great.
And I have no idea though, but you put it up very well, how many logos we really need.
Yeah. One of the things that, I'm glad that you brought the point up about the wayfinding. I think, having done this for almost 20 years, one of the big things that I promoted early on was this like complete and total integration, making sure that your brand gets integrated into the wayfinding signage. But just like Aaron said, we have found that a community needs to be able to adapt and update their message and their image more regularly than they need to be updating their wayfinding signage. So if we're trying to force this idea that every time you update your message and your look, you also have to update your wayfinding signage, you're actually creating a dynamic that logic is telling you to slow down and not be as nimble. So by preserving something that already exists while introducing this kind of economic development brand, it actually gives us the opportunity to adopt a system of being more responsive to our market while still saying, hey, we are acknowledging and preserving everything that we've invested in. So.
Well, I think it's fantastic. I think that this is all for us here in the township, but we just gotta figure out how to use the tools that you presented in the best way. A lot of that's gonna be new to us. So it's key for us to figure out, the chain of TV, painting the banners and making windows, how we can best use what you presented. I think that's just fantastic.
And we'll provide guidance on that too in the written documentation that we do. So one of the things that Ben does as part of the community branding is actually like a branding style guide as part of those too. So
Yeah,
that'll
there'll
really
be
help.
a full style guide. We created a one-pager called How to Be a Brand Partner that is intended to be shared with event organizers and businesses throughout the community that give them a whole host of ideas of how they might be able to take advantage of the brand. We will give a one-page implementation checklist. Everybody always thinks that there's like a fixed rollout strategy. That's not the way communities work either. So we've created a comprehensive list so that you can prioritize, identify low-hanging fruit, identify the most cost-effective implementation tools for the township. And then we'll also be including what we've developed called Brand Score. Brand Score is an implementation score sheet that you can revisit each year and help you to identify what might make most sense for you to make the most impact over the next year. So we truly try to make it as easy as possible for you to implement in a cost-effective way from a municipal government level, and then also clearly identify the things that you need outside help to go through and do with the marketing. We're always very, very deliberate about this idea that you follow the money and you make sure that the money is fueling the message. And when you have a CVB, that is a visitor-oriented message, and it is a fuel to tell that. So we try to very clearly delineate visitor message from these other more local government, local pride, and kind of economic-oriented messages.
And with that style guide, then we, the township, can bring that across our documents, resolutions, minutes, things like that. So
Exactly. And all the resources will be shared in a single link with a digital format. So we'll define all colors. We'll give you 5 different file formats in every single logo. So we literally will give a comprehensive package. We've purchased the typeface for you so you can integrate that in and have access to it. So all those things, we try to, like I say, try to make it as easy as possible to implement and roll it into the kind of standard operating procedure of the township.
Having actually implemented his system before, Ben actually did our branding for our company and for PlaceLEAP and everything. He makes it so incredibly easy to be able to just take those files, put it on something, and run with it.
I didn't see anything for Old Orchard.
I haven't done it yet.
Sorry.
Yeah, I haven't forgot. I just didn't get there yet.
There's 2 O's there.
There are 2 O's there.
And a P, yeah.
And a P. Well, y'all, thank you so much.
Thank you. Yes,
Hopefully,
absolutely.
you can tell from the presentation that, I mean, obviously you know Joe, but I absolutely fell in love with the community and the opportunity here, and I hope that shines through in the recommendations that we're making and the things that we're sharing with you all. I think that you've got a dynamic story to tell. You deserve to have some of the things that you don't, and I think that being able to help the community partner organizations know where they might fit into this plan, helping the chamber to really focus in around what purpose they might be able to serve in these, helping the CBB to understand, how it is they contribute to this overall story. I think that it will help these entities to both work in concert together and be efficient in achieving their purpose. So we're excited to see how it progresses. Thank you all so much.
Thank you. Sorry, we went a little over time too.